My name is Claire Whitmore, and I was 35 years old when my parents decided my brother deserved everything. They made the announcement on a Sunday afternoon in my mother's dining room with roast chicken on the table, and my grandfather barely 3 weeks in the ground. My father cleared his throat, lifted a folded document, and said the family needed to move forward. Then he informed everyone that Grandpa's farm, the main house, the lake cabin, the equipment sheds, and nearly every acre of Whitmore land would pass to my younger brother, Evan. My mother smiled as if she were announcing a scholarship winner. Evan looked surprised for about 3 seconds before deciding he liked the idea. Around the table, relatives nodded, murmured approval, and talked about legacy, family tradition, and how Grandpa had always loved having a son to carry the name. Then my father looked directly at me and said something I would remember long after I forgot the details of the meal. "Your grandfather knew you built a good life for yourself, Claire. You don't need any of this." The room became very interested in their plates. Nobody challenged him. Nobody asked why the granddaughter who had spent every summer repairing fences, feeding livestock, balancing Grandpa's accounts, and driving him to medical appointments suddenly needed nothing. Nobody except Grandpa, and unfortunately for everyone at that table, Grandpa had planned for exactly this conversation. The strange thing was that while my father held up his document, there was something sitting in my purse. A small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. The key wasn't valuable. It wasn't gold. It didn't open a vault full of money. Most people would have looked at it and seen nothing at all. But Grandpa had placed that key in my hand 6 months before he died, and he had made me promise something. "Don't use it unless they force you to," he'd said. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Grandpa was 87 and stubborn enough to argue with weather forecasts. I laughed and slipped the key into my pocket. He didn't laugh back. "Promise me, Claire." So I promised. Then I forgot about it. At least until my father announced that everything belonged to Evan. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people discover that dignity lasts longer than revenge, and where the quiet person in the room is often the one holding the truth. If you've ever watched someone make plans with something that wasn't actually theirs to give away, then this story is for you. Let me take you back 8 months before that dinner, back before the funeral, back before the inheritance. Back to a rainy Thursday afternoon when Grandpa handed me a key and changed the ending of a story nobody else knew they were writing. 8 months before the inheritance dinner, Grandpa Whitmore called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if I could come by the farm after work. He didn't sound sick. He didn't sound emotional. He sounded like himself, which somehow worried me more. My grandfather had spent 87 years becoming the kind of man who never wasted words. If he called, there was a reason. So I drove the 40 minutes out to Whitmore Farm after work and found him exactly where I'd expected, sitting on the old porch overlooking the south pasture with a mug of coffee balanced on one knee. The farm had been in our family for 4 generations, 212 acres of rolling fields, oak trees, weathered barns, and enough memories to fill several lifetimes. Most people saw property when they looked at it. Grandpa saw history. I sat beside him and watched the cattle move across the far field. For a while, neither of us spoke. Silence never felt awkward with Grandpa. It felt earned. Eventually, he reached into the pocket of his flannel jacket and pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. The tag had one word written on it in black marker: North. He turned the key over in his hands before offering it to me. "Keep this somewhere safe," I laughed and asked what it opened. He looked out across the pasture instead of at me. "A door." "That clears things up," I said. Normally, he would have smiled. This time he didn't. "I'm serious, Claire." Something in his voice made me take the key. It wasn't fear. Grandpa Whitmore didn't do fear. It sounded more like disappointment arriving early. I slipped the key into my purse and asked him why he wasn't giving it to Evan. My younger brother was the obvious choice if you listened to my parents. Evan carried the Whitmore name forward. Evan was supposed to inherit the farm someday. Evan was the son. My grandfather finally looked at me. Because Evan never asks questions. Then he took a long sip of coffee and changed the subject. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Looking back, it might have been the most important thing he ever said to me. The next few months followed their usual pattern. I visited every weekend. Evan rarely visited at all. He lived 20 minutes away, but somehow always had reasons he couldn't make it. Work, friends, travel, plans. My parents always defended him. "He's busy building a future," my mother would say. The strange part was that Grandpa never argued. He simply nodded and asked if I could help repair a fence or balance another stack of invoices. By then, I was 35 and worked as a senior accountant for a manufacturing company in Cedar Falls. Numbers made sense to me. Farms often didn't. Yet somehow I spent every Saturday helping Grandpa manage the business side of an operation everyone assumed would someday belong to Evan. The farm accounts, the property taxes, equipment maintenance schedules, insurance renewals. Grandpa showed me everything, not because he was preparing me to inherit it, at least that's what I believed. He said he simply needed help. And unlike most people in my family, Grandpa never asked twice. Then, 3 months before he died, something happened that should have made me pay closer attention. My parents hosted a family barbecue. Evan arrived late in a brand new truck he definitely couldn't afford. My father spent 20 minutes showing it off to relatives. Meanwhile, Grandpa sat quietly at the picnic table watching everyone celebrate a vehicle purchased with borrowed money. At one point, my father raised a glass and announced that Evan would someday be the future of Whitmore Farm. Everyone applauded. Everyone except Grandpa. I caught him staring down at his plate, not angry, not jealous, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from hearing the same mistake repeated for years. Later that afternoon, while helping him back into the house, I asked if something was wrong. "No," he said. Then after a pause, he added, "People spend so much time deciding who deserves something that they forget to ask who's willing to take care of it." I thought he was talking about the truck. I wouldn't realize until much later that he was talking about the farm, and about the key sitting forgotten in my purse. The last summer of Grandpa's life was unusually hot, the kind of heat that settles over a farm and makes even the trees look tired. By then, I was spending nearly every weekend out there, not because anyone asked me to, because somebody had to. Grandpa's knees were getting worse, and the work that used to take him a morning now took an entire day. So I handled invoices, scheduled repairs, called suppliers, and drove him to appointments when he pretended he didn't need help. The strange thing was that nobody in my family seemed to notice. My parents told everyone Evan was preparing to take over the farm someday, yet Evan rarely appeared long enough to learn where the property lines were. Once, while updating insurance records at the kitchen table, I asked Grandpa if he'd ever talked seriously with Evan about managing the operation. Grandpa looked up from his coffee and asked a question instead. "Do you know how many acres we have?" I answered immediately. 212. "How much did the North pasture produce last year?" I knew that too. Then he asked who handled equipment financing, property tax deadlines, feed contracts, and the water rights agreement with the neighboring farm. I answered every question. Finally, he nodded toward the empty chair across the table. Evan couldn't answer one. There wasn't bitterness in his voice, only fact. And facts mattered to Grandpa more than feelings ever did. A week later, my parents hosted another family dinner. The conversation eventually turned to inheritance, the way it always seemed to when older relatives reached a certain age. My mother smiled and said how comforting it was, knowing Whitmore Farm would stay in the family through Evan. My father agreed immediately. Evan grinned and raised his glass. Everyone acted as if the decision had already been made. Everyone except Grandpa. He sat quietly through the entire discussion before finally asking Evan a simple question. "What's the property tax bill on the farm?" The room went silent. Evan laughed awkwardly and guessed. He wasn't even close. My father quickly changed the subject, but I noticed something that night. For the first time, Grandpa looked disappointed enough not to hide it. Later, after everyone left, I helped him clean up. We worked quietly until he suddenly asked, "Do you know what ruins most families?" I assumed he meant greed, or money, or inheritance fights. He shook his head. Assumptions. Then he stacked a plate into the dishwasher and continued. People spend years assuming they know what somebody wants. Then they're shocked when reality arrives. At the time, I thought he was speaking generally. Looking back, I think he already knew exactly what was coming. 2 months later, his health declined faster than anyone expected. It wasn't dramatic, no emergency, no single event, just small signs accumulating like clouds before a storm. He tired more easily, walked more slowly, forgot things he normally remembered. My parents started visiting more often once doctors became involved. Evan started showing up too. Suddenly, everyone had time for Grandpa. Everyone had opinions about his future. Everyone wanted to discuss the farm. I noticed something else. The closer Grandpa got to the end of his life, the more nervous my father became. Not sad. Nervous. He asked unusual questions, whether Grandpa had updated his paperwork, whether his attorney had visited recently, whether there were any changes the family should know about. Grandpa answered every question the same way, with a smile. Then one afternoon, about 6 weeks before he died, he asked me to drive him into town. We stopped at a small brick building near the courthouse. I recognized the name on the sign immediately. It belonged to his attorney. We spent nearly 2 hours inside. When Grandpa came back out, he looked strangely peaceful. As we walked toward the truck, he reached into his pocket and tapped the place where the brass key had once been before giving it to me. "You still have it?" he asked. I nodded. "Good." Then he climbed into the passenger seat and stared out the window. "You're probably going to hate that key before this is over." I laughed because the statement made no sense. Grandpa didn't laugh, and for the second time, he made me promise not to use it unless I absolutely had to. At the time, I thought it was just an old man's mystery. 6 months later, sitting at my parents' dining table while they handed everything to Evan, I realized it had never been a mystery at all. It had been a warning. Grandpa died on a Tuesday morning in October. The call came just after 6. I was pouring coffee before work when my phone rang and my mother's name appeared on the screen. Somehow, I knew before I answered. People talk about grief arriving like a wave, but for me, it felt more like silence, a sudden absence where something permanent used to be. The funeral was 4 days later. Nearly the entire county seemed to show up. Farmers, neighbors, former employees, people Grandpa had helped 30 years earlier who still remembered. The church overflowed. Stories were told. Tears were shed. And through all of it, I kept noticing my father. He wasn't grieving the way everyone else was. He was watching the attorney, watching relatives, watching conversations. Every time somebody mentioned the farm, his attention sharpened. At the cemetery, after the service ended, I caught him speaking quietly with Evan near the cars. They stopped talking when they saw me. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. Looking back, I wasn't. The week after the funeral felt strange. The farm sat empty except for occasional visits from neighbors checking livestock and equipment. Grandpa had always filled the place with presents. Without him, every room felt larger. I went out there alone one Saturday and spent the afternoon sorting paperwork in his office. The desk looked exactly as he'd left it. Pens arranged neatly, bills filed, calendar marked in careful handwriting. The sight of it hit me harder than the funeral had, because funerals are public. This was private. While organizing documents, I found a note tucked into a ledger. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply contained a list of responsibilities: feed deliveries, insurance renewals, equipment maintenance dates, the things that actually kept a farm alive. At the bottom, in Grandpa's handwriting, was a single sentence. Ownership means responsibility, not entitlement. I stared at it for a long time, then folded the paper and slipped it into my purse beside the brass key. 3 days later, my parents announced a family dinner. My mother called personally to make sure I would attend. "We need to discuss Grandpa's wishes," she said. The wording bothered me immediately, not because of what she said, because of what she didn't. She never mentioned the attorney, never mentioned a reading of the will, never mentioned legal paperwork, just a family discussion. The moment I hung up, I called Grandpa's attorney. His receptionist informed me that no official reading had yet been scheduled. That struck me as odd. Apparently, it didn't strike anyone else as odd at all. Sunday arrived. I drove to my parents' house with a knot in my stomach I couldn't explain. The brass key was still in my purse. I'd almost left it at home. Almost. Looking back, that would have been a mistake. The dining room looked exactly the same as it always had. Family photographs, polished wood table, my mother's good dishes. Evan arrived 15 minutes late, wearing the confidence of a man who already believed the future belonged to him. My father seemed unusually cheerful. My mother couldn't stop smiling. Then dinner ended. Plates were cleared, coffee was poured, and my father stood up holding a folded document. Not an official court document, not paperwork from an attorney, just several pages stapled together. He cleared his throat and announced that the family needed clarity moving forward. Then he explained that Grandpa had always intended for Evan to inherit Whitmore Farm. The house, the land, the cabin, the barns, everything. He spoke as if the matter had already been settled, as if nobody else's opinion mattered, as if the future had been decided years ago. Around the table, relatives nodded approvingly. Evan looked proud. My mother looked relieved. Then my father turned toward me and delivered the sentence that would change everything. "Your grandfather knew you built a successful life elsewhere, Claire. He wanted the farm to stay with the family." For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd misheard him. Stay with the family, as though I wasn't family. As though 20 years of weekends, repairs, bookkeeping, appointments, and quiet responsibility had somehow counted less than sharing a last name. Nobody challenged the statement. Nobody except the small brass key sitting silently inside my purse. And for the first time since Grandpa had handed it to me, I felt its weight. Not physical weight, something heavier. The weight of a promise that was about to matter a lot more than anyone at that table realized. I didn't say anything after my father's announcement. That disappointed him more than anger would have. People who prepare speeches expect reactions. They expect arguments, tears, accusations, something they can point to later as proof they were right. Instead, I simply took a sip of coffee and listened. My father continued talking about legacy and tradition. My mother added comments about keeping the farm in capable hands. Evan nodded at all the appropriate moments. The entire performance felt rehearsed, not professional, just practiced. Like they'd spent days convincing themselves of a story and had finally reached the point where they believed it. The strange thing was that nobody mentioned Grandpa's attorney. Nobody mentioned probate. Nobody mentioned legal documents. It was all assumptions presented as facts. Eventually, my aunt asked the obvious question. "Has the will been filed yet?" For the first time that evening, my father hesitated, only for a second, but I noticed. "Not officially," he said, "but we know what Dad wanted." That sentence landed heavily in the room, because knowing what somebody wanted and proving it are very different things. My father quickly moved the conversation forward, talking about future plans for the farm. Evan wanted to renovate the main barn, build rental cabins near the lake, lease part of the south pasture. He spoke confidently about property he didn't yet own. Every idea sounded expensive. Every plan sounded researched 5 minutes before dinner. I sat quietly and remembered something Grandpa used to say whenever salesmen came around with grand visions. It's easy to spend money you haven't earned and harder to protect something you didn't build. By the end of the evening, the farm had already been transformed into a future business venture in Evan's mind. The history didn't matter. The responsibility didn't matter. Only ownership mattered. When dinner finally ended, I stood to leave. My mother followed me to the front porch. "I hope you're okay with all this," she said softly. It wasn't concern, it was confirmation. She wanted to know whether I would challenge the narrative. "Why wouldn't I be?" I asked. Relief flooded her face. "I knew you'd understand." That's the thing about being the reliable one in a family. People mistake your patience for surrender. They mistake your silence for agreement. They mistake your dignity for weakness. My mother hugged me, kissed my cheek, and told me Grandpa would be proud of how mature I was handling everything. Then I drove home. Halfway there, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't expected: Samuel Pierce, Grandpa's attorney. I pulled over before answering. "Claire?" he said. "I've been trying to reach your father all afternoon." Something in his tone immediately sharpened my attention. "Why?" I asked. There was a pause. "Because the official reading of your grandfather's will is tomorrow morning." I stared through the windshield. Cars passed, rain tapped softly against the glass. "Tomorrow?" I repeated. "Yes." Another pause. Then he added, "And based on several conversations I've had recently, I strongly suggest you attend." The line went quiet. Suddenly, I could feel the brass key in my purse again. Samuel didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The moment the call ended, I understood something important. My father wasn't announcing the future because he knew what Grandpa wanted. He was announcing it because he was afraid of what Grandpa actually wanted. That night, I barely slept. The key sat on my kitchen counter beside Grandpa's handwritten note about responsibility and entitlement. I must have looked at both a dozen times. Around midnight, I finally picked up the key and studied it carefully. Small brass body, old teeth, leather tag with the word North written across it. Nothing special, nothing dramatic. Yet somehow, Grandpa had trusted this little piece of metal more than the people sitting around my parents' dining table. The next morning, I arrived at Samuel Pierce's office 15 minutes early. Evan was already there. My parents arrived 5 minutes later. The moment my father saw me, surprise flashed across his face. Not because I came, because he clearly hadn't expected me to. And for the first time since Grandpa died, I had the distinct feeling that the real inheritance conversation was finally about to begin. Samuel Pierce's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building overlooking the courthouse square. Grandpa had used the same attorney for nearly 40 years, which meant Samuel had learned long ago not to underestimate him. The conference room was already prepared when we arrived. A long wooden table, 4 leather chairs on one side, 3 on the other. A single file folder sat in front of Samuel's chair. My father noticed it immediately. Evan noticed the coffee. My mother noticed me. Nobody said much while we waited. The tension in the room felt strange because everybody believed they knew what was about to happen. Everybody except Samuel. At exactly 9 o'clock, he entered carrying a thick file box and a legal folder. The moment he sat down, my father leaned forward. "Let's get started," he said. Samuel adjusted his glasses and opened the file. "We'll begin with the formal reading of Robert Whitmore's final will and testament." The room went still. Samuel read slowly and carefully, the way attorneys do when every word matters. Most of the opening sections were ordinary: charitable donations, personal belongings, a few gifts to relatives and friends. Then he reached the section everyone was waiting for: Whitmore Farm. I watched my father's shoulders straighten. Evan sat up. My mother folded her hands tightly in her lap. Samuel cleared his throat and continued reading. "The ownership, operation, and stewardship of Whitmore Farm, including all associated structures, agricultural assets, and land holdings, shall transfer to..." He paused briefly while turning the page. The individual who possesses the North Key and fulfills the conditions outlined in Schedule B. For several seconds, nobody moved. My father blinked. Evan frowned. My mother looked confused. Samuel continued reading as though nothing unusual had happened, but I barely heard the next sentence because my attention had locked onto 3 words: the North Key. Slowly, every person in the room turned toward me. Not because they knew, because they remembered seeing me carry something Grandpa had given me months ago. My father's face drained of color first. Then Evan's confidence cracked, just slightly, like ice beginning to break. Samuel finally looked up from the document. "Miss Whitmore, do you possess the item referenced in your grandfather's will?" Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. The same key Grandpa had handed me 8 months earlier. The same key my father had never asked about. The same key sitting quietly in my kitchen while everyone else decided the future. I placed it on the table. The soft, metallic sound seemed impossibly loud. Samuel nodded once, not surprised, almost relieved. Then he opened another folder labeled Schedule B and said something that changed the entire room. "Your grandfather anticipated there might be assumptions regarding the inheritance. Therefore, he left specific written instructions explaining exactly why this key matters." Across the table, my father stared at the brass key as though it had personally betrayed him. Evan looked from the key to me and back again. And for the first time since Grandpa died, nobody in the room was talking about what they thought he wanted. They were finally about to hear what he actually said. Samuel opened Schedule B and removed 3 handwritten pages attached to the will. The handwriting belonged to Grandpa. I recognized it immediately. So did everyone else. "If this section is being read," Samuel began, "then certain members of my family have already started deciding what should happen to my farm, without bothering to ask what I decided." My father shifted in his chair. Samuel continued, "Whitmore Farm does not belong to the person who wants it most. It does not belong to the person carrying my last name. It belongs to the person who proved they would protect it when nobody was watching." The room went completely silent. Samuel read every word exactly as Grandpa had written it. He described years of visits, repairs, bookkeeping, medical appointments, late-night phone calls about broken equipment, tax filings, insurance renewals, and responsibilities most people never noticed. Then came the sentence that landed like a hammer. One grandchild treated the farm like an inheritance. The other treated it like a responsibility. Those are not the same thing. Across the table, Evan stared at the surface of the desk. My father's jaw tightened. My mother looked as though she wanted to interrupt but didn't dare. Samuel kept reading. Grandpa explained that the North Key opened a locked room above the original North Equipment Barn. Inside that room were records, journals, contracts, maps, and instructions accumulated over 40 years. The key itself wasn't the inheritance. The inheritance was understanding what the key protected. Then Samuel reached the final page. "If Claire chooses to accept stewardship of Whitmore Farm, ownership transfers immediately according to the terms of this will. If she declines, the property will be sold and the proceeds donated to agricultural education programs. Under no circumstances does ownership transfer automatically to Evan." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sentence seemed to hang in the air. Under no circumstances. Grandpa had anticipated exactly this moment, exactly this argument, exactly this assumption. For months, maybe years, he had known somebody would try to turn his life's work into a birthright. Samuel carefully folded the pages and placed them back on the table. Then he looked directly at me. "Miss Whitmore, your grandfather left one final written instruction to be delivered only after Schedule B was read." He opened a smaller envelope and handed me a single folded sheet. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't move. The room disappeared. The farm disappeared. The inheritance disappeared. All that remained was the familiar handwriting of the man who had taught me how to drive a tractor, balance a ledger, and tell the difference between ownership and responsibility. Slowly, I unfolded the paper. The first sentence made my chest tighten immediately. Claire, if you're reading this, then the key finally did exactly what I hoped it would do. And suddenly I realized the inheritance battle everyone thought had just started had actually begun long before Grandpa died. He had simply been the only person who knew it. I read the letter twice before I looked up. The room remained silent. Even my father seemed to understand that interrupting Grandpa's final words would be a mistake. Claire, the letter began, families have a habit of confusing inheritance with reward. They think property is something you win. It isn't. Property is responsibility that arrives disguised as ownership. The people who want it most are usually the people least prepared to carry it. I swallowed hard and continued. Grandpa wrote about the first time he noticed the difference between Evan and me. Not a dramatic moment. Not a life-changing event. A broken fence after a summer storm 12 years earlier. Evan had stepped over the damage and continued walking. I had spent 3 hours helping repair it without being asked. Grandpa remembered. Then he described dozens of other moments I had forgotten entirely. Feeding cattle before sunrise when he was sick. Driving through a snowstorm to deliver medicine. Spending weekends balancing farm accounts nobody else cared about. Reading insurance documents when everyone else was watching football. The letter wasn't sentimental. Grandpa rarely was. It was factual. A list of observations collected over years. The kind of evidence only a patient man would bother keeping. Then I reached the paragraph that changed everything. The room above the north barn contains records going back 40 years. More importantly, it contains proof. If anyone questions why the farm was left to you, take them there. Let the records answer for me. Across the table, my father shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, he looked worried rather than disappointed. Samuel quietly folded his hands and waited. I continued reading. I know your father believes the farm belongs to Evan because he carries the Whitmore name. I know your mother believes tradition should decide what happens next, but tradition is a poor substitute for judgment. If names alone qualified people for responsibility, every family business would succeed, and every inheritance would be preserved. We both know that's not true. Evan looked down at the table. Nobody defended him. Nobody argued. Because deep down, everyone in the room knew Grandpa wasn't talking about names. He was talking about effort. Then came the final section. The section Grandpa had apparently saved for last. There is one more thing inside the room above the north barn. A sealed metal box. If you're reading this, it belongs to you now. Open it only after you've decided whether you actually want the farm, not before. Ownership should be a choice, not a prize. My eyes stopped there. A sealed metal box. Another secret. Another layer. Suddenly, the brass key felt heavier than it had an hour earlier. Samuel took the letter gently and returned it to the envelope. That concludes your grandfather's written instructions, he said. Then he closed the file and looked around the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, my father cleared his throat. There must be some misunderstanding. Samuel's expression didn't change. There isn't. My father tried again. Dad always intended Evan to continue the family line. Robert Whitmore anticipated that argument specifically, Samuel replied. That's why he documented everything. Then he opened another folder. My stomach dropped slightly when I saw how thick it was. Dozens of pages, notes, logs, records. Grandpa hadn't simply written a letter. He had spent years building a case. And judging by the look on my father's face, he was beginning to realize just how thoroughly he had lost this fight before it ever started. Meanwhile, All I could think about was the room above the north barn. The room, the key opened, and the sealed metal box waiting inside. Because for the second time in less than an hour, Grandpa had reached across death itself and reminded everyone in the room that he was still 3 steps ahead of them. An hour later, I stood in front of the north barn with the brass key in my hand. Samuel had insisted on coming. To my surprise, so had my father, my mother, and Evan. Nobody wanted to admit it, but curiosity is stronger than pride most of the time. The north barn sat at the edge of the property beneath a row of old oak trees. Most people barely noticed it anymore. The lower level stored equipment and feed. The upper level had been locked for as long as I could remember. As a child, I'd asked Grandpa what was up there. He always answered the same way. Things worth keeping. At the time, I thought he meant tools. Now, I wasn't so sure. We climbed a narrow wooden staircase that groaned beneath our weight. At the top sat a weathered gray door with a brass lock. For a moment, nobody spoke. My father stared at the lock, as though seeing it for the first time. Evan looked uncomfortable. My mother folded her arms tightly. I stepped forward and slid the key into place. The lock turned immediately. No resistance, no hesitation, almost as if it had been waiting. When the door opened, dust drifted through sunlight spilling from a small window on the far wall. The room wasn't full of treasure, it was full of records. Shelves lined every wall, binders, journals, ledgers, property maps, tax files, equipment logs. 40 years of Whitmore Farm documented in extraordinary detail. My father looked disappointed for half a second before realizing what he was actually seeing. Proof. Years and years of proof. Samuel walked slowly toward one shelf and removed a binder labeled Farm Operations, another labeled Property Management, then another. Each one contained handwritten notes, dates, maintenance records, names, observations. Grandpa had documented everything. And then I noticed something. One entire shelf contained only my name. Claire, Claire, Claire. Dozens of binders. My father noticed it too. Slowly, I pulled one down and opened it. Inside were records going back almost 15 years. Every visit, every repair, every accounting update, every insurance review, every appointment I'd driven Grandpa to, every fence repaired, every weekend worked. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't sentimental, it was evidence. Grandpa had kept score while nobody else was paying attention. I opened another binder, then another. The pattern never changed. Meanwhile, Evan's name appeared only occasionally. A visit here, a holiday there, a birthday, nothing more. The room became very quiet. Finally, my father sat down heavily on an old wooden chair. For the first time in my life, he looked genuinely unsure of himself. Then Samuel pointed toward the far corner of the room. A gray metal box sat beneath a workbench exactly where Grandpa's letter said it would be. Small enough to carry, large enough to matter. The box had another lock, and hanging from the handle was a note written in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. My hands tightened around the paper before I even opened it, because suddenly I understood something. The farm wasn't the inheritance. The room wasn't the inheritance. The records weren't even the inheritance. Whatever Grandpa had spent years protecting was inside that box. And judging by the expression on Samuel's face, he already knew it was about to change everything. For a long moment, nobody moved toward the metal box. The room felt different now. Smaller somehow. Heavier. The kind of silence that settles over people when reality begins replacing assumptions. Finally, Samuel handed me a small envelope he had removed from one of the shelves. Your grandfather instructed me to give you this before opening the box. My name was written across the front. Again. Grandpa seemed to have planned every step of this day years in advance. I opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The message was short, much shorter than the last one. Claire, if you're standing in this room, then you've already learned who wanted the farm. The box will tell you who protected it. Those are rarely the same people. I read the sentence twice. Then I slipped the letter into my pocket and knelt beside the metal box. The brass key didn't fit this lock. Instead, taped beneath the note was a smaller silver key. Grandpa had hidden it in plain sight. My father took a step forward. Evan did too. Neither spoke. For once, nobody had a speech prepared. I unlocked the box and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were 3 items, a thick stack of documents tied together with twine, a leather journal, and a sealed envelope marked, "For the family." Samuel recognized the documents immediately. His eyebrows lifted. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains a lot." I picked up the stack first. Property surveys, land records, historical deeds. At first, they looked ordinary. Then, I reached the final page and everything changed. The document wasn't about the farm itself. It was about the land surrounding it. Hundreds of acres that had been sold decades earlier. According to Grandpa's records, a development company had spent years trying to purchase access rights through a specific section of Whitmore property. Without those access rights, a major commercial project couldn't move forward. The latest offer sat clipped to the front page. I stared at the number, then stared again. $26 million. Across the room, my mother gasped. Evan looked like he had forgotten how to blink. My father simply sat there, motionless. $26 million. The farm everyone thought was just a collection of fields and barns had become something else entirely. Something valuable enough to change lives. Then I opened the leather journal. Every page contained Grandpa's handwriting, notes, observations, decisions, and near the back, a section titled, "Why, Claire?" My chest tightened immediately. Page after page described moments I'd forgotten. Things Grandpa never mentioned while he was alive. He wrote about responsibility, character, patience, reliability. He wrote about the difference between people who love ownership and people who love stewardship. Then came the final entry, the last thing he ever wrote. If Claire inherits this farm, it survives. If someone else inherits it, they will eventually sell pieces of it until nothing remains. I am not leaving land to a name. I am leaving responsibility to a person. The room went completely silent. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Because sitting in that room were 15 years of evidence proving exactly why Grandpa made his decision. Then my eyes moved to the final item inside the box, the sealed envelope marked, "For the family," and somehow I knew that whatever was inside mattered even more than the $26 million offer sitting in my hands. Grandpa had spent years preparing for this day. The inheritance battle everyone thought was about land was actually about something much larger. And for the first time, my father looked genuinely afraid of what his own father might say next. For several seconds, nobody touched the envelope. $26 million sat on the table. The future of Whitmore Farm sat on the table. 15 years of Grandpa's observations sat on the table. Yet somehow, all of our attention remained fixed on one sealed envelope, labeled, "For the family." Finally, Samuel nodded toward it. I believe Robert intended that to be opened now. The paper felt old beneath my fingers. Grandpa had probably sealed it months earlier, maybe years. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded several pages. The first line immediately pulled every eye in the room toward me. If this letter is being read, then somebody has already tried to decide my wishes without asking me. Across the room, my father looked down. I continued reading. Grandpa didn't waste words. He never had. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. He explained that families often confuse fairness with preference. People assume equal love requires equal inheritance. According to Grandpa, that belief had ruined more families than greed ever had. Then he addressed each of us directly. My mother first. He thanked her for caring about tradition, but reminded her that tradition without judgment becomes laziness. Then he addressed Evan. The room became so quiet, I could hear pages moving in the breeze from the open window. Evan, you are not a bad man, but for most of your life, other people have protected you from consequences. Protection feels like love when you're receiving it. It feels very different when life finally sends the bill. Evan stared at the floor. Nobody moved. Grandpa continued, "If you want to become the man your parents already believe you are, stop waiting for inheritance to build your future. Build it yourself." Then came my father's section. I almost didn't want to read it aloud. Almost. "Richard, you spent years believing a last name qualified someone for responsibility. It doesn't. Character does. Effort does. Reliability does. If you are angry with my decision, ask yourself one question. Who visited when nobody was watching?" My father closed his eyes. For the first time all day, he looked old. Not defeated, just tired. Like a man suddenly forced to examine a story he'd been telling himself for years. Then I reached the final page. The page addressed to everyone. The farm was never the point. The land was never the point. Money is never the point. The real inheritance is knowing who a person becomes when nobody is keeping score. I kept score because someone had to, and because someday people would confuse noise with contribution. When that day arrived, I wanted facts available. I stopped reading. Nobody spoke. Nobody argued. Because sitting all around us were shelves filled with facts. Years of them. Proof stacked floor to ceiling. The room above the north barn had become a courtroom, and Grandpa had spent 15 years gathering evidence. Then I noticed one final handwritten sentence at the bottom of the last page. A sentence separated from everything else. A sentence written larger than the rest. The key was never for the room. It was for the truth. Suddenly, I understood why Grandpa had smiled when he handed it to me. The brass key had never unlocked property. It unlocked reality. And reality was finally standing in the room with all of us. The strange thing was that I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. Mostly, I felt sad, because none of this had been necessary. Grandpa shouldn't have needed 15 years of records to prove what he already knew. Yet, here we were, and judging by the look on my father's face, he finally knew it too. The only question remaining was what happened next, because the inheritance battle was over. But the lesson Grandpa intended was just beginning. We stayed in the room above the north barn for nearly another hour, but the important part happened in the first 5 minutes. Nobody argued. Nobody demanded another explanation. Nobody claimed Grandpa had been manipulated. The evidence sitting around us made those arguments impossible. 15 years of records have a way of ending debates. Eventually, Samuel packed the documents back into their folders and reminded me that ownership of Whitmore Farm now officially belonged to me if I chose to accept it. That was the funny thing. After months of assumptions, arguments, expectations, and inheritance talk, the final decision still belonged to me. Everyone slowly made their way downstairs. My mother left first, quiet, thoughtful. The certainty she'd carried into the attorney's office that morning had disappeared somewhere between the first binder and the last page of Grandpa's letter. Evan lingered near the barn door. Before leaving, he stopped beside me. "I didn't know," he said. For a moment I thought he meant the will, the records, the $26 million offer, but then he shook his head. About any of it. And for the first time in years, he sounded honest. Not entitled, not defensive, just honest. I told him I knew. He nodded once and walked away. My father was the last to leave. We stood beside the fence Grandpa and I had repaired together a decade earlier. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, he looked out across the fields and said something I never expected to hear. I should have paid more attention. It wasn't an apology exactly. My father wasn't built for apologies, but it was probably the closest thing he had, and strangely enough, it was enough. Not because it fixed the past, because it acknowledged it. After he left, I walked back into the north barn alone. Sunlight streamed through the small window. Dust floated through the air. Everything felt quiet again. I picked up the brass key and turned it over in my hand. The key that had started all of this. The key everyone thought opened a room. Grandpa had been right. It never opened a room. It opened the truth. 3 months later, I declined the $26 million offer. People thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. But Whitmore Farm wasn't an investment opportunity to me. It was responsibility. Just like Grandpa said, we expanded operations, restored the North Barn, created an agricultural scholarship in Grandpa's name. And for the first time in decades, the farm's future wasn't being discussed by people who wanted it. It was being built by people willing to care for it. My father visits more often now. Evan, too. He even learned the property tax bill. Grandpa would have enjoyed that. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I sit on the same porch where Grandpa handed me the brass key and watch the sun disappear behind the south pasture. And I think about how close everyone came to missing the point. The farm wasn't the inheritance. The $26 million wasn't the inheritance. Even the land wasn't the inheritance. The inheritance was a lesson, a simple one. People spend so much time asking who deserves something that they forget to ask who is willing to take care of it. That's my story. One brass key, one locked room, and a grandfather who understood that the truth doesn't need to be loud when it's been keeping records all along. If this reminded you that character is built in the quiet moments nobody applauds, take that as your sign. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.